The Lord Mayor has sent us an exciting challenge of thinking about risk responsibly with a growth mindset, looking at how it can be used to mobilise for growth, innovation and resilience. So it's really fitting that our first panel will unpack the topic of how do we balance growth ambitions with realities of shifting global geopolitical landscape. The panel will look at what does it mean to lead risk with foresight and resilience. So please welcome our moderator, Fiona Robertson, Editor-in-Chief at Insurance Insider, and her expert panel.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm Fiona Robertson, Editor at Insurance Insider. I feel like a little bit of an outsider in the room and that I'm not a CRO, but I do know headlines, and headlines these days are highlighting the geopolitical volatility around the world, as we've already heard. And I do also know insurance. Our publication covers the specialty London and international markets, and they certainly are very focused on risk. So I'm really excited to hear what our panel has to talk about today. As Anna said, we're going to be very much trying to focus on how CROs can get involved in trying to lead growth at their companies. So I would encourage you all to take the chance to ask your own questions of the panel. So we do have, I believe, a Menti forum online for you to ask questions on your phone, and the details should pop up at some stage to allow you to do that. In fact, the QR code I can see is on the screen, along with the code if that doesn't work for you. So we'll take the questions towards the end, but for now I would like to start the conversation just by inviting my panel. Obviously we've already heard from the Lord Mayor, but I would like to ask the other panellists just to introduce yourselves briefly. Chika.
Thank you, Fiona. I'm Chika Aghadiuno. I'm the Chief Risk Officer at Munich Re Specialty Global Markets. I've been in that role for 2 years now. I lead a team of about 40, which includes a number of risk specialists, but also compliance experts, some lawyers, and also company secretarial. Prior to that, I worked for Aviva. I joined that organisation as a graduate, so a number of years there doing a number of different roles, starting off in the actuarial space, before pivoting to enterprise risk quite a few years ago. Outside of my core day job, I'm a non-executive director for a medical defence organisation. I sit on the Audit and Risk Committee for UK Sport, and I do some advisory work for the UK actuarial profession, the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries.
Joe?
My name's Jo Lucas. I'm the Chief Risk Officer for Mizuho EMEA. My role covers the whole of Mizuho's presence in the Europe, Middle East and Africa. So that includes our trading business, banking business and capital markets business. My role covers financial and non-financial risks. So I have teams covering market, credit, liquidity and operational risk, as well as looking at risk methodology and model risk. I've been at Mizuho for 2 years, and prior to that, I worked at Nomura and Bank of America Merrill Lynch.
Thanks, Joe. My name's Dr. Cormac Bryce. I work at Bayes Business School. I was the lead researcher on the Cornerstone project that has brought you through the rain today to come to this event. And in doing so, we've created a risk report that was looking at the role of the Chief Risk Officer in optimising growth, which we feel was a really important piece of research in order to align what the Chief Risk Officer does with the perceptions and misperceptions of what others feel that they do in their day-to-day work. So I'd like to thank you all for coming. I feel an element of responsibility bringing you here.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you. I'd like to start just by going back to your research, Cormac, a little bit, wondering if you can outline some of the key findings that you came up with.
Yeah, sure. So the project kicked off just over 18 months ago, and it was an informal discussion between myself, the Lord Mayor, and the Dean of the Business School. And I think at that point in time, we were very much trying to get a feel or a sense for what it was to be a CRO, and whether or not the role of the CRO had a platform and had been represented fairly in terms of its development over time. And we realized very quickly that of all of the senior management functions, it was probably actually the Chief Risk Officer who had the least representation and probably had the largest amount of misrepresentation attached to it. We then went through a significant piece of data collection with Chief Risk Officers within the city representing the FTSE 100, FTSE 250 companies. And off the back of that, what we were trying to get a feel for and an understanding of was what they do, how they do it, why they do it, some of the barriers to being able to do that, and how they see their role, not just in threat protection, but also in value creation. And I think a big part of that comes off the back of the 2008 banking crisis, the evolution of the Chief Risk Officer role, and I think it's probably fair to say that that role has evolved significantly over the last 15 to 20 years. I was asked at breakfast earlier on how well received the report was by the CRO community, and I can confirm until now, nobody has rang me up and shouted at me about it. So I felt an enormous amount of privilege in being able to chair and head up that research, but I also felt an enormous amount of responsibility in being an advocate and a voice for the Chief Risk Officer community, which is culminating today in what we see with the summit. What I would say, and what I would like to reinforce with regards to the Lord Mayor's comments, I very much see this as the start of a larger platform and initiative for giving the Chief Risk Officer community in the UK a platform to work from. Our research has been very clear. I feel with that platform, there can be much more intrinsic value derived from understanding that role within UK financial and professional services.
I think one thing I found really intriguing was about the outcomes of that research was the idea that you'd grouped the types of functions you might perform into really nifty categories like architect, firefighter, Swiss Army knife, conductor. So I hope you've all had a look and figured out when you're being a Swiss Army knife or when you're being a firefighter and which one resonates with you at different times.
Yeah, we spent an inordinate amount of time trying to categorize those personas. I think it's probably important for everyone to understand we don't view people in isolation. Throughout all of our research, it was clear that at any given point in time, Chief Risk Officers can be putting on many hats, sometimes simultaneously. But the big thing that became clear very early on is there is a delicate balancing act within the Chief Risk Officer role that you may not necessarily see within other roles where they're dealing with this duality of threat protection and value creation. And I think the Swiss Army knife is an excellent way of understanding the role of a Chief Risk Officer because at any given time they can be operating at 30,000 feet or 30 feet. A lot of Chief Risk Officers will probably say they would prefer not to be operating at 30 feet because that's not necessarily their role, but sometimes that's what required of the role in terms of keeping the show on the road with regards to the organisations. So I find it fascinating in terms of investigating Chief Risk Officer. I know some of you in the room probably think I'm crazy for saying that, but I think from going through this significant piece of research, it's been really clear that there are really interesting conversations to be had with regards to the CRO community and furthering their endeavours within that community. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, let's dig into hearing from the CROs on our panel. So, as we've been mentioning, at the moment it feels like there's just a general perception that the world is just getting incredibly risky, that compared to a couple of years ago where we've got so many more headlines about instability and various different pockets of the world popping up every day, it feels like, at least. So I wanted to start by asking our panel whether you feel that this perceived shift is actually changing corporate behaviour. And perhaps, Joe, if we can start with you, do you see a difference in business reactions to this environment of risk?
Certainly, I think, personally, I don't think that necessarily risk is increasing, but I think it is true to say there are a number of new risks, and new risks are quite frightening for our stakeholders and our shareholders. So part of our responsibility within the risk community is to be helping those people understand the so what. what does it mean when those risks arise, and what does it mean for us as an organisation, and how can we mitigate the impact to us as an organisation. And I think what has evolved is I think people are getting much more familiar with the language of risk. They're much more comfortable talking about what it means and how we measure it and how we measure its impact. And I think that's really important, that we continue to educate people and make people understand what risk is and how we talk about it, so that when things do happen and risks are seeming to increase, we can be talking the same language and everyone can be understanding on the same page what that means and how we can understand how that impacts us.
Mm-hmm. Are there any sort of key things that you find useful in terms of breaking that down or getting everybody on the same page?
As I say, I think it is about making sure we're talking the same language. I find using real-life examples, using scenarios or stress testing is really important, because it helps make people realise that a risk might be on the horizon, it's something that might be coming, but it gives people that comfort that if it does happen, we know what we're going to do about it, we know how we're going to react. And also when it does happen, or we do become in a crisis situation, it does help us to be able to say to those stakeholders, this is how we've talked about it before, this is our game plan, this is what we're going to do. And it stops that knee-jerk reaction, it stops that pulling back. Often we find people are very keen for growth in the good times, but when things get a little more difficult, they're more likely to pull back. So if we've already talked about what those bad times mean, it means that we're less likely to have a knee-jerk reaction when things don't go to plan.
Okay. I guess it's possible that the flip side of this era of uncertainty or new risks puts the focus on the CRO, so we're gathered here today. Do you feel that there's been any shift in recognition of the role of CROs, that you're getting more visibility? Chika, would you kick us off on that one?
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement, that over the years, and I think it was Lord Mayor Cormac who alluded to that the role has, there's greater awareness of not just what we do, but the need for it, a greater appreciation for how it can add value to the business. In most cases, many cases, I think that is true. Why might that be? I think there is the rigour, the disciplines that can be brought to the table to a business that underpins a lot of what we can offer to the business. There is the experiences that many organisations have lived through over the years, and those risks, to Joe's point, have always existed. From an insurance point of view, we deal in the business of risks. They may pivot, they may evolve, and the perception may be that there are more, or the spectrum of uncertainty has evolved, but we operate in that world. The other element, of course, is we as chief risk officers have to demonstrate our worth, and I think increasingly we are deploying tools, approaches that have supported that, I guess, that relationship with the business. So therein lies, I think, the magic. So there's having the rigours, the disciplines, the frameworks, of course, but also that appreciation, that understanding that when you bring those two together, then it's all for a common goal, and that being in support of the business. We have a motto at Munich Re, it's not if, but how. And I would deploy that to the role of the CRO as well. And it's not no, but yes, if. And scenario planning is a great example of that, but some of the frameworks that we set out in the cool light of day before we're in the midst of whatever drama might be playing out, and we can revert to those. That's the plan, that's the idea. But those scenario plans are nothing if you can't bring them to life, if you can't make them stressed, if you can't be creative in developing them, and also have tangible actions and outcomes as a result. Otherwise, they get filed away, and you think you've done a good job, but actually it's meaningless unless there's value to add to that.
It sounds a bit like the stand-up motto, yes and. The CRO equivalent is yes if. I like that. Okay, so in terms of this topic of how do we encourage growth in this environment, Joe alluded to the sort of possibility that firms will pull back when they're confronted with new risks and have that head-down mindset. Cormac, do you have any thoughts on how CROs can move into that growth enabler mindset and encourage firms out of that head-down mindset?
Yeah, so the research was really clear where CROs that were looking upstream, not necessarily as what we would classify emerging risks, but actually emerging opportunities, is a real area for them to demonstrate value and value creation and the potential for growth within the business. We're seeing it, we're living in it at this moment with the rollout of AI, machine learning, automation of operations and processes. These all sit within the remit of the Chief Risk Officer in terms of driving efficiencies that lead to growth within the business itself. There were lots of examples within our research of Chief Risk Officers highlighting their ability to create value in the business and never letting the opportunity of a high-scale, high-profile event go by without them being able to identify and use that to highlight what they've done and what they do through their scenarios to ensure that the business and the wheels stay on the wheels stay on the vehicle when it's rolling forward. It was almost 10 years ago to the day I'd done a piece of research for the ACCA, who were looking at consultation for the Financial Reporting Council. At the time of us collecting the data for that, the TomTom data hack had just happened. We were interviewing FTSE 100 CEOs and CFOs. It became very clear in those interviews as the news developed on a day-by-day basis that there was a blind spot in FTSE 100 companies for tech and cyber risk. And I think we're probably seeing the evolution of that now, both within the role of the CRO in being able to create that value add, how they face off to the CISO, and how they lean into what essentially is an extremely messy market with regards to cyber risk at this moment in time.
Well, I think we've all had a very good reminder of that lately with the M&S hack. But cyber insurance has been one of those niches that has really grown up and hopefully help companies respond to that kind of issue. So again, I would just like to remind you that if you have any burning questions for the audience, you can use Menti to ask them. And I think AI is probably one that we should come back to because it is just such a core topic right now in terms of grappling with this new technology. But I want to start with something more core, I suppose, to the traditional view of the CRO, and that's around your involvement in regulation. We've discussed this idea that the CRO has a bit of a tension between how do you manage the risks while encouraging growth, and in some ways you could see that as similar to the risks or the balances that the regulators have to try and walk at the moment, especially in the UK, as we're having more of a focus on regulators trying to encourage competitiveness and how can they do that while still maintaining standards. So I'd like to start with the question of whether there are any regulatory shifts that would help you as CROs perform your roles more effectively. Joe, are there any thoughts you have on the regulatory environment in that respect?
So I think from my perspective, that the key is that we make sure we keep regulation and risk management as aligned as possible. I think that has two impacts. First of all, if we have regulation and risk management aligned, it means that the budgets that we have can be used to fulfill both requirements. To Chika's point around saying, yes, if you've got to go and do something because the regulators have asked you to and because you want to ensure for good risk management, it means that you're going to be limited as to what you can say yes to. So it's very important that we think as those two as aligned. And secondly, if regulation becomes a sort of a tick box exercise, if it becomes something we have to do rather than something we think is useful, it starts to lose its respect and it starts to lose people wanting to get behind it. So I think it's really important that we maintain that relationship between regulation and risk management. They're not two different things. We're both trying to achieve the same aim. We're both trying to work in a risk-controlled environment and do the best for our organisations. And I think the UK has historically been very good at having more of a principle-based regulation and very keen in terms of ensuring that it's up to the organisations themselves to really be the forerunners of deciding what they should be controlling, and the regulation is just there to support that and ensure that the worst cases are picked up. So I think it's really important that we continue that, and there is that support to make the regulation as risk sensitive as possible.
Okay. So when we're talking about this fundamental sort of balancing act between the rigour that you need to have in terms of meeting requirements, regulatory requirements, and also trying to be commercial, Chika, do you have any thoughts on, how you try to strike that balance, or any tips for the audience in terms of what you find useful?
Yeah, so rigour versus commerciality. I think I would put at the forefront of that we are all on the same page. We work for organisations where we have the organisations, the consumers at the top of our mind. So we're on the same page. That's an important starting point to acknowledge. So the question is, how do we achieve some of those objectives of the business? So I spoke earlier about the rigours that certainly I can bring to the table around the frameworks, the guidelines, the processes to support the business as it makes all of the commercial decisions that it needs to do on a day-by-day basis. So that's fundamental to my mind. I would also encourage and do the business to take ownership. So I don't put myself out to be the expert in quite a lot of things. So I know who the experts are within the business, and they need to be coaxed, encouraged, supported to identify for themselves what the risks are in the business that they manage and they run, and feel empowered to be able to lean into that and take the necessary mitigations, make sure the necessary controls are in place to allow them to fly with whatever ideas and opportunities that we collectively have identified. So I think that's important because we lose sight of that. It's not for the rest to come along and say you can't do this and purport to be the expert. We are not, but we can take a step back, look up and out, and ask some of the questions that perhaps haven't been asked. If you're in the weeds of the business, sometimes you might miss some of that big picture thinking, which actually, once you ask some of those questions, if you ask enough of the right questions, it can actually allow the business to go even further. It can be self-limiting if you don't think and stop in that regard. So some of those things I think are helpful, and also just making the notions of the frameworks and the wider principle of risk management relevant to the particular parts of the business that you're talking about. If you just quote sections of a rule or a guidance and come with your clipboard, that really isn't going to work. But if you really have a deeper, thoughtful conversation around what is it that makes this business or this part of the business successful, how can you open your mind to what the opportunities are? How can you be truly ambitious? We have an Ambition 25 at Munich Re, which was launched some years ago, which we are delivering on. But we do that. You have to have something like that. You need to be creative. You need to have an open mind. But if you do that in a guided way, in a considered way, that I think is the answer.
I think I just found the point of commonality between journalists and CROs. It's the asking of the questions.
Oh, yeah,
there you
for
go.
sure.
Well, I want to delve into some specific cases that might be really relevant for CROs right now in terms of global challenges. So one is and this is somewhat more still with the regulatory theme, around the increasing divergence that we see between different markets and approaches to things like ESG and D&I standards. So that's creating friction for global firms that are trying to manage this divergence and divide. And I'd like to ask the panel what challenges you are seeing and how you see people responding to this trend. And I know that the Lord Mayor, I believe, has been speaking to global firms about this topic, so I'd like to start with you.
Right, thank you. One example I can give you, certainly in relation to my travels abroad. I was in India about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and I was in the office of one of the big patriarchs of one of the big commercial families. You'd recognise the name. And he said, Alastair, where are the Brits? I used to have a Brit in my office once a week. I now have a Brit in my office every second month. And I have Germans, I have Italians, I have French, I have Americans, and I have Chinese people in my office. But the Brits seem to have retreated. And this is India. India is growing at 6.5%. If your economy is growing at 6.5%, then your economy is growing, sort of doubling every 11 years. And so I just sort of sense that that puts it into context in relation to, and again, there's been no regulatory change over the course of the last 5-8 years for doing business in India, or very little. But I think somehow the interpretation is such that not the same number of people are going to this gentleman's office to try and do business with them. I think further to your point, though, I think that there is a I think there's a desire to remember that businesses are there to be forces for good, but also businesses are there to build things. And I think that there's a new balance that has been struck, which I think is sensible. But I think that we've got to go ahead and remember that we've got to go and build things. We have to go off and build things. There are all sorts of things that we can do off the back of it, but the core purpose is to build remarkable things in our businesses, and that's something that I don't think that we should forget. I think also the other sort of key element is there's obviously the involving people on a number of different levels, and I think to the point just being made by Chika, I think is that effectively it's about asking questions, about involving people, but with the purpose though of building something really remarkable, and that's something that I don't think we should forget.
Do either of the CROs or Cormac have any thoughts on this challenge around the increasing divergence in ESG, D&I standards, where you might have one arm of your company being asked to, or being very much more concerned about carbon goals or D&I goals, and another part of your company in a different area being very much still focused on those? How does that impact your work?
If I were to take a step back from that, I would say that as a multinational organisation with risk exposures across the globe, we're well used to dealing with the complexities of international jurisdictions, different regulators. So this is another in the general considerations that we would have to make. So we continue to do that. In conversations I've had more broadly in recent months with other organisations, I hear a common narrative there that they also feel that way. They are interacting with this perceived change in landscape and those sorts of differences to the best of their ability. The response will be different, and it will depend across different firms depending on how they operate, where they operate, and also how the various uncertainties and divergences that you allude to continue to evolve. So it's not static. But my sense is that no one is seeing any of this as being unmanageable, but it is clearly something to navigate.
Mm. I'm getting the sense that it takes a lot to phase a CRO. So just a reminder, you can also put in your questions, and we will move into taking some questions from the Menti panel towards the end of the session. But I want to move on to another big picture topic, and that's AI. And in fact, you know that it's become a top of mind conversation when you exit Bank Tube Station this morning and see the advertising signs are all about AI. And I found it quite interesting that the slogans were saying that something like 88% of people were interested in using it, but 44% were too afraid to take the chance to. I suspect the proportions are probably very different in this skilled room. But there's that sense with AI that while it could be a huge lever for growth or efficiency, it's also something that is perceived as a risk in terms of what kind of regulatory issues could we run into if we don't get this right, and that might be holding some companies back from adoption. So I would like to ask how you are all approaching this task of trying to manage that downside risk while still potentially look for what your AI upside could be. So perhaps can we start with Cormac?
Yeah, so as part of the research, we brought up the idea of emerging risks, but it actually comes back to what Joe was talking about earlier on. And not to sound like I'm coming from an ivory tower, I think the language around risk is really important. The lexicon of risk, the duality of risk is fundamental to how we frame these phenomena. And AI was a recurrent theme, as you can imagine, collecting this data last summer. The overwhelming response from the CROs was that AI is an opportunity that the business itself will need to adopt in some way, shape, or form. What that adoption will look like in its final form, they did not know, but ultimately it becomes a threat to the business when they see it from an emerging risk that can't be dealt with from within the business itself. So it spoke to the malleability of these chief risk officers who are having to consistently look at things from multiple different perspectives, using different lenses to look at new emerging phenomena. I'm cautious not to say emerging risks. And that's because what may very early in the inception look like a threat may actually become quite a strong positive opportunity for the business itself. Mm-hmm. And it speaks to the prowess of these chief risk officers in being able to understand from an early adoption perspective what it may look like 3, 5, 10 years in the future for the business and their operations. Mm-hmm. But the lexicon of risk is important here when we're talking about, I think, upside and downside, particularly around AI. Yeah.
So we have got some questions on AI, but the first one is very much what we're talking about now. How are you trying to handle the risks and opportunities? Joe, do you have a take on AI and how you're handling that balance?
Yeah, absolutely. As Cormac said, I think we're looking at it very much from two different perspectives. The first is, as the Chief Risk Officer, our responsibility is to ensure that what AI is used within the organisation is done so in a responsible way, and in a way that we can trust it. Certainly, I sometimes can't sleep at night when I think about the possibility of our salespeople or our traders going out and using AI and giving that information to clients as if it comes from us as an organisation. And that's something that we need to make sure there are strong guardrails around, and that we know who's using it and how they're using it, and how that information is being perceived externally. But then there's also huge opportunities for it. There's certainly a huge amount of risk that processing that we do, the number crunching that we do, the data gathering that we do, that can be predominantly outsourced to something like AI, where we can definitely then use our individuals that we do have to do much more of the analysis and much more of the thinking on top of that data gathering. And if we don't get behind that as an organisation, we're going to be left behind. So it's very much making sure that we are proceeding carefully, we're taking the advantages where we are confident that we can build those guardrails around it, but also proceeding cautiously to make sure we're not doing anything that could put our organisation at significant risk because of something that we've said, or something that or we've done that is been fed by AI but is not correct.
Are either of you making any use of AI yourselves in the CRO work that you are doing? Chika?
So I think AI is a brilliant example of both the opportunities and risk side, as has been alluded to. So from what I'm seeing is that, yes, this is a huge opportunity in ways that not all of us can imagine. If I reflect back over the past couple of years and our use of, our appreciation of what AI can do for us and is continuing to do for us, it's changed exponentially even in that period, and probably ChatGPT has got something to do with that. But from a business point of view, we have engaged with the technology, the the developments of AI for many, many years, actually, from an insurance point of view. So therefore, alongside that, from a risk management point of view, in the broader sense, we also engage with it. So there's an element of walking and probably latterly running alongside this technology and the business as it dabbles with it. And yes, operationally, we continue to consider what we can use. I mentioned the 3 or 4 disciplines that I have within my team. We're constantly looking to see how operationally we can utilise some of this technology in order to support what we do and how we do it, as indeed others are. But the reality is, it's there, we're engaging with it, even if we don't realise it. So you only need to flick open your phone and do a Google search these days, that whether you like it or not, AI in its many different forms, we talk about, how we, the taxonomy of this, there are, you have to be careful about what you're actually talking about, but it's there, we are operating within it, and we are evolving, adapting our frameworks accordingly as we go along.
Okay.
I think just to that point, it's probably worth pointing out that your customers of the future, they're already using it. They're using it every day. It's embedded in everything every 18 to 21-year-old is currently doing. I see it on a daily basis. I'm dealing with the brightest and best students in London at the business school, and they're using it for everything, literally everything. It's amazing. I've never had so many eloquent and well put together emails, essays. It's there. It's not going away. It's going to become further and further embedded, and I think businesses need to understand and lean into that. And I think, again, it comes back to this idea of understanding the opportunity, but understanding what that opportunity creates with the guardrails that Joe's been talking about. Yeah.
Could I come in as well on that? In fact, I've seen, certainly in my observations, we hear what Chika's been saying in relation to Munich Re and a large company, and they've been integrating AI with their systems over the course of many, many years. I think there's a big differential between the large companies and the SMEs. And I think that therefore big companies, they'll be all right. They've been adopting, they've got whole departments working on it, big teams. I think where I think there's more of an issue I sense is in the small accountancy companies, the small legal firms, the small sort of other ones. They do not have the big budgets to implement. That's where I think we should really be sort of directing some of our efforts on that, because there is still a need for much greater adoption in that cohort. And it might be an absolutely fitting thing for one of the meetings of the soon-to-be-formed CRO network to discuss how best to roll out elements of AI among SMEs in financial, professional, legal and maritime services here in the United Kingdom.
Okay. So let's take a question from the floor, and we're moving on to a topic that I know is coming up later in the day as well, but around protectionism. And do we think that businesses overreact to events such as the tariffs initially? Is there a tendency to overreact to the impact of things like the tariffs?
I think from my perspective, a little bit of reaction and panic is sometimes a positive thing. Certainly when you have things like tariffs that were not totally unexpected, but perhaps the scale and the comprehensiveness of the initial Liberation Day announcements was unexpected. I think it is important that we don't become immune to those sorts of shocks. We do need to make sure when something like that happens, we do put our brains in gear and think about what does this mean. And sometimes that does involve having to make some noise and having to perhaps ask some questions that in hindsight weren't necessarily the right questions, but in asking lots of questions, you do ultimately get the right questions answered. So I do think it is important that we do react and we don't think that just because there's a lot of risk that we can just keep on carrying on calmly. But I do think, to what we said right at the beginning, it is important that we think ahead and we have that playbook ready so that when things do happen, we can react calmly and we know what we should be thinking about and asking at the time to make sure that we capture everything that we need to do.
Another question perhaps getting to the sort of type of person you are being asked to be as a CRO. Are CROs now moving towards being quasi-politicians, managing relationships and getting ahead of international policies, as opposed to the traditional view of a quant-based CRO?
I think that's a fascinating question, and I don't want to be disrespectful for any politicians that are out there, but I hope the answer is no. However, there is a very, very significant people element to the role. So relationships and understanding of human behaviours. We're all flawed individuals, and we need to allow the creativity, the understanding to flourish. So you need to be mindful of the non-quant elements for sure. So to be effective, to be impactful, to get the outcomes that we're all seeking to achieve for the business, you do need to deploy a spectrum of skills, I would suggest.
What do we see as the blockers from your businesses to see risk as a function for driving growth? So when you are trying to portray the risk of the view of risk as a growth enabler, what blockers do you come up against?
So I think that's the question that was fundamental to the research project, really, to be honest. I think an element of it is actually lack of understanding of the role of the CRO and their team. I think another aspect of it, and I'm not speaking from being within the business myself, is a lack of accountability and responsibility within the business for their own risks, and feeling that it's actually somebody else's job to manage their risks. I think that came across quite strongly from the research. What we also tended to see was that when the CRO and the risk teams were brought in on new product approvals, pipeline projects late in the process, it becomes more difficult to have a yes-if conversation, because the yes-if conversation should happen much earlier on in that conversation with regards to the new product pipeline. So when we were looking at the research, the blockers were a lot more subjective than objective formal blockers, and I think some of it was the requirement of the business to do a bit of soul searching for itself as to what their roles and responsibilities were with regards to the management and accountability of risks within their own business. I also think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, John Chika, that there's a paradox for the CRO in their senior management function, the SM4 role. It's very much focused in terms of roles and responsibilities around controls. So there's a paradox there for them and nuance, I think. And I think there was a lot of nuance in the research when CROs were trying to be progressive, trying to be value creating, because the harsh reality is within the SM4 function, it's very much about the implementation of a control framework. So it becomes difficult for them in those conversations as well, based on what's in black and white for them. So, yeah. Okay.
I think we've got time for just perhaps one more. The question is, as innovative trends like digital assets are progressing at different speeds across the market, how should risk leaders balance the growth opportunities with effective risk management to stay competitive? So I think really that's probably getting a little bit back to the AI, digital assets question. Does the fact that it's progressing at different speeds mean that you have to bring anything different to this role?
I think the key word in that sentence is balance. And I think it absolutely is a balance, and that's part of our role, and that's where you talked about sort of the different skills that you need. It becomes much more of an art rather than a science, in terms of making sure that we are letting the business develop, letting the business look at those opportunities, making sure that they have that sort of that playground or sandbox that they can be starting to understand how they work. Because there's another element of, it's all right to say yes if, and we say yes if you learn about it and you know all about it and you can prove to me you have that skills. If things like digital assets, they're never going to learn those skills, they're never going to understand how the market evolves unless they're actively involved in it. So it is a little bit around making sure we build a way that we can be innovating and using those growth opportunities, but not in such a way that they are so large to the organisation that they could have significant impact. So making sure there is sort of the ability to do things in a small scale, and we can take those learning opportunities to then grow going forwards.
All I would add to that is that there is proportionality that needs to apply often. There will be a de minimis level of controls and oversight and requirements, but depending on what the situation requires, a degree of proportionality can prevail.
Okay. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our time. So I think we've heard some really valuable lessons about the sort of mindset that is required to pursue this growth in the face of all these headlines that clearly are not making the CROs of the world get into a flap, which is great. So I would like to invite you to thank our panel, and I'll pass on to the next speaker. Thank you.